folks are asking this question, how do I get engaged? How do I contribute in a way to see the change that I want to see in my community? And my response is the same. My response is do what you can where you are with what you have. And I think for those folks who are questioning about how do I engage, or how do I be part of creating a Mississippi that I want my children to fully thrive in, change starts right there where you live. And so one way that you can get involved and get engaged is to join your local NAACP unit. If you don't have an active unit in your community, it creates a space and opportunity for you to re-energize, recharter, redevelop that local NAACP branch to create a space where like-minded people can come together and address those issues that are happening in your local community. So.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kabir Kareem. I'm a state representative of House District 41, representing the city of Columbus and Lowndes County. I'm also the vice chair of the Mississippi Legislative Black Caucus and a former city councilman here in Columbus. I am also a member of the Lowndes County NAACP, where our president is Madam LaVon Harris. I'm so honored to moderate such an important discussion on community policing. I'm always thrilled to participate in NAACP forums. Our topic today is a very important issue, and I remember discussing the same topic not long ago at an NAACP conference in Natchez. We discussed the creation of civilian review boards as a way to improve community police relations. But unfortunately, things have not improved in our communities, nor in our nation. The recent deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the countless others, brothers and sisters, have placed the topic of police brutality back in the headlines and at the top of our radars this year. And we are still left with a plethora of questions. How do communities work with law enforcement to ensure safety and security without feeling like victims? How can law enforcement agencies inform communities about disciplinary measures without affecting the safety of the officer and personnel policies? What programs can we put in place to reduce crime and to improve relationships between community and law enforcement? You know, one of the last issues I had to deal with as a Columbus City Councilman was the death of a young man by the name of Ricky Ball, who was killed by a police officer. Ball's killing led to the establishment of a civilian review board in Columbus, and the officer who killed Ricky was indicted on manslaughter charges. His case, extremely political, which unfortunately Attorney General Lynn Fitch dismissed the charges against Kenyon Boykin, citing a lack of evidence. This furthers our mandate that our work must continue. Today, I'm delighted to have a diverse panel to talk about the issues of community policing and their important work on this issue. We have Rukia Lumumba. She is the founder of People's Advocacy Institute in Jackson, Mississippi. People's Advocate Institute works on several electoral justice and criminal justice reform initiatives. Sister Rukia serves on the City of Jackson's Public Safety Committee, which implemented a policy regarding the release of photographs of officers involved in the shootings of citizens. Also on the panel, we have Dr. Andre Ori. He's a professor of political science at Jackson State University. Dr. Ori created a program that can help police officers assess implicit bias through virtual simulation. He will discuss some of those findings. I look forward to that, Dr. Ori. And finally, we have Sheriff Rolando Fair. He made history when he became the first African-American sheriff of Grenada County. He's a former state trooper who has used his influence as an African-American man in law enforcement to help others in the community and he'll discuss some of that work today. So let's get started, panelists. Sister Rakia, I'm gonna start with you. Let's talk a little about your work in the city of Jackson with the Public Safety Committee.
Yes, how's everybody doing? Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for everyone who's watching and a part of this amazing convention. I think that it's an important convention that happens every year. And I'm really excited that we're talking about this issue of criminal justice, specifically as it relates to policing. So here in Jackson, I have the opportunity to sit on a public safety task force, which was actually developed as a result of 9 police officer involved shootings that occurred here in Jackson in 1 year. And as a result, community really demanded that there be some type of action taken and some type of accountability. And so in response, the mayor of Jackson, Chokwe Antar Lumumba, pulled together a task force that would actually be composed of community members, advocates, as well as police officers. In this task force, we were initially tasked with determining a policy on how to respond when there is an officer-involved shooting. Specifically, some community members were asking that we immediately release the name of the officers involved, that we release video, and a number of things. In Jackson, we hadn't had a policy in place at all that talks about how to respond when an officer is involved in a shooting of a resident. And so what we ended up doing after several months, about 6 months, is police officers, along with community advocates and activists, as well as community members and people who had been actually survivors of police violence, we finally reached a consensus around a policy that I believe is one that is pretty dynamic, in that it not only allows for transparency in the process of investigating an officer-involved shooting, but it also really takes consideration of the family of the person that has been harmed by the officer. And so the policy allows for video to be released. It also allows for officers' names to be released, but it also allows for a process by which we consider the safety of both the family and the person that was harmed, as well as the safety of the officer. And so in both circumstances, the police department has an opportunity to weigh in and determine if there is a significant threat of harm to the officer, if the name is released, as well as the family. And this is the first time I've heard this, and we studied a lot of different policies, but we had a position where is the family okay with releasing the video and the officer's name when their loved one was actually harmed by that person. So it gives consideration of the family. And all of this has to happen within 72 hours. The even more special part of all of this is that even where the police department decides that it does not want to release the officer's name, there is a 3-panel small commission that determines whether the police department was justified in not releasing the officer's name. And they have the ability to say that they don't agree with the police department's decision not to release the officer's name, and we can release that information. So that's how we started.
Rakia, let me do a follow-up on that. How was that received? How was the Public Safety Committee, how was it received by law enforcement and community establishing the committee?
You know, to be honest, initially, and I mean, you would imagine so, officers were not excited to be a part of this commission. But over time, over a 6-month period of time, what we saw is that we were all able to work together, and we were able to really dive deep into a policy, and it took a lot of debate. So we engaged in this process of unity, debate, unity. And we had a lot of unity, and then we had a lot of debate to get us back to a place of unity. And I think what really helped guide us is looking at other policies in other cities. And so by the end of this, what we saw was that officers were committed to the policy that we created. We didn't have much pushback at all. We actually reached consensus. It wasn't a vote and you have, a certain number of people choose to go with it here and a certain number of people voted against it. We actually had consensus, meaning that all of us decided that this was a proper policy. What was even greater than that is that not only did we all agree that this was a proper policy, but we also all agreed that this committee needed to move past just looking at officer-involved shootings, and that we needed to look at the entire excessive force policy here in Jackson, Mississippi. So we asked the mayor to convene us a second time to extend our time and our scope to actually look at the entire excessive force policy. What that ended up doing was that we're currently in session, currently meeting to actually consider the development, following the lead of Columbus, the development of a community oversight board or commission. We're figuring out what it'll look like.
Thank you for that. Dr. Ori, can you talk a little bit about the Implicit Bias Project and how this work could help reduce incidents of police violence?
Sure. Thank you all for having me this evening. So at Jackson State University, we have a political science research laboratory. It's faculty led, but student operated. And two of the methods that we use in the lab are looking at explicit attitudes and implicit attitudes. So explicit attitudes are based on survey data. And so, excuse me. And so recently we conducted a survey with a jurisdiction comparable size of Jackson in the Deep South. And we asked questions related to attitudes toward the police. And so we had them, for example, in an open-ended question, asked them what are the three of the most problematic areas that you would address for this city. And 65 out of 100, 65% included crime in their list. Also, how safe do you feel around your house during the day? 28% said that they did not feel safe. And then the quality of policing. 45% of those surveyed indicated that the quality of policing was poor. And so, using explicit surveys, we're just now starting to take a dive into the data, but it does suggest that people do value law enforcement. And so that's the tension that jurisdictions have. You got these cliches of law and order from the conservative right. And so it creates a tension with respect to some folk being ambivalent. They want to be protected on the one end, but they don't want police brutality on the other end. And so we also have an implicit bias set up where, a lot of political pundits and politicians over recent years have employed the term implicit bias. And it's really been overused, but not understood. So implicit bias are unconscious attitudes that associate a group with negative or positive stereotypes. And that association is automatic. It's not something you can sit there and think about. You only have a split second to make a decision. And that decision is based on, one, how you were socialized. So you have these different agents of socialization, which could be, your peers growing up, your parents, your church, so on and so forth. But, individuals are socialized. And, once those, attitudes form in these referent bins that we have in our mind, then we can easily pull them out. Or if they're not there or we don't use them much, it'll be less easier to pull them out. So it inhibits our ability to pull them out. So in terms of the methods that we use and the operation that we have, we wrote these computer scripts that we borrowed from a colleague out of Colorado State. But we examine whether or not police officers shoot African Americans more in error relative to whites. And the difference or the uniqueness of our study relative to these other studies across the country is we focus only on African Americans. And so because I live in a city that's roughly 80% Black, and I would imagine 80-some-odd% Black police officers, then my focus is on African American police officers. And so we conducted an analysis where, you know, it's a game that's I don't want to say played, but it's a game that's on the computer. And I use the word game loosely, and I really don't want to use it because psychologists use these tasks to gauge individuals' implicit bias. So what we do is we have images of a person with a gun or a person with a telephone or something, or a Coca-Cola can, and we have them in black and white. And so the individual will show up on one's computer less than a second. Actually, about 800 milliseconds is the highest, but we go down as far as 500 milliseconds. So that's a split second. That's less than a second. And so you either decide to shoot or don't shoot. So you push one key to shoot, you push the other key to not shoot. Now, the point here is that you're still making a decision. You're still making a decision. You don't have the adrenaline rolling where you have a gun in your hand, but you are making a decision, and it's a cognitive process that's at work. In addition, we have an actual simulator where they do have a gun. So they have a 9mm Glock 17, and then we have another gun that we use in the lab. But with the Glock 17, you actually get recoil. We have an oxygen tank that provides that experience. And to my knowledge, you know, there are not many jurisdictions that actually have this particular set of equipment. So I use it for experimental purposes or research purposes, but it's very underutilized. And so I do need to connect with, you know, police agencies or law enforcement agencies to really give them opportunity to use this equipment.
When you start talking about implicit biases, does it cross racial lines? What have you seen in your studies?
Thank you for reminding me that I was supposed to talk about that. So what we found was African American police officers who make errors in shooting blacks, unarmed blacks, were more likely to possess attitudes that were resentful toward blacks. So in addition to the work on police officers, we've been doing intra-racial attitude studies. And so we examine, you know, internalized racism. We examine what we call intra-racial resentment. You know, blacks would only try harder. They could be just as successful as the Jews and Italians made it. Blacks should be able to make it as well. And so, you know, there are quite a bit of blacks who have those particular attitudes. And what we found is that those black officers who had resentment toward black people, their own people, were more likely to shoot in error. And in comparison, we have a measure of racial identity, and there are multiple dimensions that you have, but one dimension that we have in political science is linked fate. That is, does your fate or outlook on life depend on others? Or do you think what happens to other blacks will impact your individual life is the question. And those blacks who had an affirmative response to that, suggesting that they are strongly linked to the community, were less likely to shoot blacks in error. We think that's a very, very strong finding.
Interesting. Very interesting. Sheriff Fair, how you doing?
I'm doing all right.
Look,
how you all doing tonight?
I'm fine, fine. Look, what are your thoughts about some of the recent incidents of police violence? And what, if anything, have you done to change practices in your county as a result of these incidents? And by the way, congratulations on your win as far as being sheriff of Grenada County.
Thank you. Some of the modifications that I did with the sheriff office here in Grenada was I started the neighborhood patrols at least 3 times a day. As the officer did these patrols through the neighborhoods, they were to get out of their vehicle and have conversations with the residents while promoting social distancing. Therefore, that was giving us a better connection with the residents, and they would also tell us some things that's going on within their community. I implemented implicit bias training with all officers. We also went to less than lethal use of force with the importance of using the tasers. I tried to instill in each officer that you don't treat every encounter with the same aggressive manner. Learn to de-escalate the situation at hand. When officers lose their cool or engage in unconstitutional practices, the situation becomes worse. Police officers are there to police others, but we have to take into account that we got to police ourselves as well to make a difference. And the biggest thing is getting involved into the community.
Okay. Now, this question is for all three of you all. I'm going to start with Dr. Oren. We've just elected a new president. The state just voted on a new flag. My question is to all of you all, do you think these election results signal a significant change in Mississippi and the nation in terms of race relations? Dr. Oren, I'm going to start with you.
Issue for about 20 years, exactly 20 years. I left the state in 2001. I was teaching at the University of Mississippi. And when the flag vote hit, you know, it kind of kicked me in the gut because I was just returning to Mississippi from long stay in graduate school. So I've been following this, and the first, in 2001, when we had the referendum, it was voted 65% to keep the Confederate battle flag part of the state flag. And we conducted research, and we found that, you know, old-fashioned racism, which, you know, people would think, oh, duh, it's associated with support for the flag. But empirically, that hadn't been found. And so, you know, even with respect to David Duke, old-fashioned racism wasn't associated with him, but this new racism was. And so that was a big finding. But the fact that the legislature, and they did this in Georgia, which, you know, was very shrewd, the fact that the legislature made the decision to change the flag was a good thing. And it was a good thing that, you know, the citizens voted to embrace this new flag. However, the intentions are the question. During that same election, the electorate supported and voted in Cindy Hyde-Smith, who had suggested that, you know, she would be on the first row of a hanging if one of her supporters were speaking. And so that's a conflict or a tension. Even the day that they signed the bill, Tate Reeves basically locked out, literally, the Black legislators. And so they weren't there to be a part of that monumental, you know, occasion. As it relates to the country, you know, we live in Mississippi, and there are a lot of disillusioned people. You know, Barack Obama was president, but their wages didn't increase. And so, you know, until economic development reaches a place like Mississippi, until, you know, voter disenfranchisement, you know, stop preventing folks from voting because of the barriers associated with it, we're not making much progress. We've made progress, but clearly, not to be so cliche, is we definitely have a long way to go.
Sister Rakia?
Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, I do think we've made progress. I think, you know, I am the type of person that looks at the glass half full, right? But I think that we're a little more than full. I think that passage of the flag, and I was actually finishing my undergrad time at Tougaloo College during the referendum in 2001, and worked hard organizing people around voting for a new flag. And so I was very excited to see this new flag pass. And I acknowledge, and I'm very well aware, that this new flag passage was really about the movement of the people. It was a movement of young people, as well as some, not so young people. It was an intergenerational push here in Mississippi. It was a huge push by, players across the state who were on these large football and basketball teams who stood up and said, we won't play. We will hurt the economic pockets of this institution and of this state if the flag isn't changed. It was also about the continued work of people, Black women like Anjanou Ellis and even, Dr. Adelia Carthen, who, consistently fought, to raise issues of the flag, including like Danielle Holmes and Sharon Brown and Shambi Lambright. I mean, so many women. I can name, so many Black women who did that, as well as, like some of our white allies like Leah Bird and Melissa Garriga. I can go on. I don't want to keep naming names because I don't want to get in trouble and forget someone. But this was definitely an intergenerational move. Frank Figures, moving, getting arrested, doing disobedient actions, last year to continue to push this issue. And so I do think that the movement of the people helped to move the flag. And I'm not naive to not recognize that it wasn't just the movement that was happening here in in Mississippi, not just in Jackson, but in Mississippi, but it was also the movement that was happening nationally. Sometimes you just have the right people at the right time, right? And I say that we were the right people here in Mississippi, and it was the right time nationally to really push the issue around the flag coming down. It also was a perfect time we saw here in Mississippi over the past 2 elections since 2018. We saw a true increase in progressive outcome. We are seeing progressive numbers increase in the state. We saw it in 2018 when we had the special election between Mike Espy and Cindy Hyde-Smith. And I would, venture to say that we saw it this year. I think that we saw it with the passage of 3 ballot initiatives. We had the passage of medical marijuana initiative here in Mississippi. We saw the flag, and then we also saw the doing away of the Jim Crow election policies that we had here. And I think those are things that we don't want to ignore. And I think they're signs that we are moving, that our people are becoming more educated, and our people are becoming more organized to actually move and engage in the electoral process as one way, one tool of actually moving us towards freedom and justice. So I think we are. Yeah, I'll stop there. I'll stop there.
Well, no, you were on point, and I just want to. I would be remiss if I didn't remember those Black Caucus members whose shoulders we stand on, who constantly produce legislation every year to try to get rid of the flag. Through my research, I remember Dr. Aaron Henry was one of the first legislators to try to do away with the flag through legislation. Congressman Benny Thompson led a lawsuit with a plethora of advocates in the early 90s trying to get rid of the flag. So there have been countless of individuals who have paved the way for us to cherish this particular moment here. And if you ask me what happened, it was really divine intervention, because going to session or being in session, never heard of a discussion about we're going to change the flag. There always have been Black Caucus members pushing their pieces of legislation that would die in committee, but we never knew that this was going to be the year that we were going to get a new flag. But I just wanted to throw that out there. And before I go to Sheriff Fair for his response on this particular question, I found this. I always keep this quote in my Rolodex because I never know when I might have to use it. But it comes from Lyndon B. Johnson. And I don't know if you all are familiar with this quote, but he says, If you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. He'll give him somebody to look down on, and he'll empty his pocket for you. That's President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965. Sheriff Fair, what's your thoughts on the question that was posed as far as the new flag, new president? Is Mississippi, do you think the results signal a significant change in Mississippi and in our nation?
Yes, I believe that we're moving in the right direction, slowly, but we are moving in the right direction. A lot of the people that were against the flag at first have actually came out and are proud of the flag, proud of a new day in Mississippi and doing wonderful things. Many that I've come across are trying to differentiate from the past. They want to move forward and the community to move forward as a whole.
Yes, sir. Sister Lumumba, I'm coming right back to you. Violence in Jackson has been all over the news lately as the city has passed its 100th murder. Can you talk about the efforts in Jackson to reduce violence and the balance between keeping communities safe and violating human rights?
Yeah. You know, Jackson is experiencing the same heightened rates of violence that we're seeing across the nation and actually across Mississippi. The COVID pandemic has caused violence to escalate at enormous rates in a lot of major cities across the nation. And we've also seen it in a lot of places where economic divestment has been rampant for years. And so we see it across the state of Mississippi, as well as here in Jackson, which is the largest metropolitan city in the state. And I say all of that to say, because it's really important that we recognize the correlation between a divestment of resources in our community, COVID, and then the violence that we see as a result. When you consistently divest from mental health resources, when the state refuses to pass Medicaid expansion and thus continues to cut back on mental health services, especially in the largest city in the state, there are not enough mental health services to even help people cope through the COVID pandemic. And not even enough to help people deal with the mental health issues they were having before COVID happened. And so people are placed in really bad situations, and it increases the likelihood that violence is going to occur. You know, I had one woman that we had worked with, an elderly woman, who we had worked with to help her with her bail. And she had been sitting inside of a detention facility for 9 months because she couldn't afford her bail. She had chronic illness. She had severe mental health illness. We ended up bailing her out through the Mississippi Bail Fund Collective. She gets out. We're helping her get her Social Security back. We're helping her get her Medicare back so that she can go to her psychiatric appointments and get her on her medication again. You know, we help her for a full year. Recently, she found herself back in the mental health ward, or found herself in the mental health ward here in Jackson, one of the mental health wards here in Jackson. Because during COVID, she had again, somehow or another, they lost her Medicaid information. So she wasn't getting her regular medication. She wasn't able to travel like she normally would travel to get the therapeutic support that she would normally get. And so she found herself in a situation where she had a psychiatric break. This is something that we see happening over and over and over again with people. And that can lead to violence. And she herself indicated that, you know, I had to check myself in because I didn't want to hurt myself and I didn't want to hurt anybody else, right? And so she was smart enough to understand that she needed to check herself in. But there's so many people who are experiencing mental health breaks that don't have that recognition. And they end up causing harm to themselves or causing harm to others. There's also this issue of not having enough resources to actually provide positive youth development outlets for our young people during the COVID pandemic and thereafter. So we've seen an increase in violence by our young people who actually have nothing to do. They're not going to school, right? For many months, they weren't going to school until recently, right? Until about a month ago, 2 months ago now, I guess, right? And so what we saw is that people, they have what they say, idle minds is the devil's workshop. So we don't have things to offer our young people. Then we see things begin to increase, bad behaviors begin to increase, and things like that. And so, you know, we got to look at the correlation. COVID has also increased the amount of stress that people are experiencing, not knowing what's going to happen next, not knowing whether you're going to have your job again, when your next check is going to come in, not knowing when this pandemic would end and you'll be able to actually just get out the house and be around your friends that may have been a source of comfort, where now you're stuck in a house where you may not agree with everyone in the house and have tension, right? We're all stuck in close quarters. That also causes intracommunal violence to rise, domestic violence to rise. And so most of the violence that we've seen in Jackson, and we could probably, I would love for Dr. Ori to do some research around this, could probably see may have happened across the state, is that intracommunal violence has increased. This is violence against people who know each other. This is people who, you know, relatives who are gotten into a fight and have chosen to take it out on each other and may have pulled a gun to settle the dispute. These are neighbors who are arguing with each other and decide to take a gun to settle a dispute. These are, you know, young people who have beef over a partner that they're dealing with, a girlfriend that they might be dealing with, who decided to take it out on each other and going too far and using a gun. So this is what we're seeing. It's the lack of additional supports in our community. Programs such as like violence interrupter programs that actually help to mediate these disputes, these intracommunal disputes, who take people who have experienced violence themselves and people who have perpetrated violence and have them trained in very core, significant training around how to mediate and de-escalate and prevent harm from happening and violence from happening in our communities. People who are from those communities, who are trained in this and actually are able to stop it before it happens. We need to invest in those resources. And that's something that we're starting to do here in Jackson. It's, you know, the investment in mental health services. You know, every person should have an opportunity to go to a therapist, period. Whether you want to go or not, you should at least have the opportunity, right? All of us should have that ability. And we don't have that right now. You know, it's the investment in education and supportive services for our young people, who not everyone can sit in front of a computer and thrive, right? We need to invest in those resources. It's about investing in the resources and the opportunities for people to have jobs, right? Even during a COVID pandemic, how are people able to create an income for themselves? You know, so it's investing in those type of things, you know, and it's investing too in an opportunity for people to have adequate housing, and a number of things that really are ways that we began to tackle this intracommunal violence that really at the root cause is about stress, is about our inability to figure out other ways to handle our disputes. And so with additional tools that I think we can provide, if additional resources are provided with us, you know, to us and to our community members through community-based programs and organizations, I think that we will see, you know, the decrease in violence here in Jackson and throughout Mississippi. And that includes gun violence. And we can talk about gun violence at another time.
You know, I want to ask the panelists, look, I'm a staunch advocate for criminal justice reform in our nation, but more particularly here in the state of Mississippi. As a legislator, I'm able to introduce legislation. So I'm asking you panelists, what are some of your thoughts about potential legislation that my colleagues and I can advocate for in this upcoming session for our state? I want to start with Dr. Ori. What kind of legislation would you like to see us advocate for as it relates to community policing, as well as criminal justice reform?
Yeah, so I've been sitting in my ebony tower, cranking out reports and so on and so forth. Oftentimes get critiqued on, not taking these ebony tower issues to the concrete. But I've been thinking about the fact that and I didn't mention it, but in terms of socialization, David Banner once said that police kill blacks for the same reason that young blacks kill blacks. And it got quite a bit of flack behind that. But I understood exactly what he was saying. And he eventually explained himself is that, blacks dehumanize blacks because that's how they're socialized. So when they see on the nightly news, the first, news segment is, a black person who has committed some type of crime, even if it's, still in potato chips. It'd make the front, page of the news or, the first segment. And so there's two things, and that is, even for the police officers, the police officers are socialized whereby, they have the blue uniform and they oftentimes pit that against their black skin because it's institutional. In some instances, it is the bad apple, but in some instances, it is the orchard. And so, I've been told that when you go through police trainings, that's where they learn to have these negative racial attitudes toward blacks. And I say that to connect to your question, because we've already passed legislation whereby we're supposed to be teaching more multicultural issues happening in the curriculum. But the reason it's not being implemented is because the teachers said that they're not going to implement it. And so the legislators have already done that. But my point is that if people had these more positive imagery and substantive backgrounds of who they are and where they came from, that in my mind could constrain this resentment or intraracial set of negative racial attitudes that they have toward themselves. And until we, put that into our curriculum, I mean, I went to Adiyambo to speak once, and I had to change my script in the middle of, me sitting there having a good time with the presentation. I was changing my script because it would have been very superficial to them. And so if we take a model like that, where, I had to play a hard card with mentioning people like Henry Kirksey, folk that they wouldn't have known. These folks were, these young people were, extremely astute to who they were. And I really believe that, if we can, have them at the Civil Rights Museum, it's not going to take 1 or 2 days, like with the police officer training. It's going to have to be a program whereby we can deprogram what they've been programmed with, which is these negative stereotypes of black people.
I'm going to go to Sister Rakia, but before I do, to your point, we have to do a better job of, we're devaluing, marginalizing our community. We devalue, marginalize ourselves, and it's cultural. We don't talk about the greatness of our people and what they have produced and how we've been copied and imitated and emulated. And we don't do a good job of that, to your point. And I'm just thinking in my mind, the other day I was in the mall and I was just listening to a mom talk about, you better behave or I'm gonna get the police, or there go a policeman over there. Do you want to go with him? Culturally, we've done some things too that have kind of, and look, blemished the relationship between police and the African-American community, using them as a ploy for discipline actions towards our children. Some people might not agree with that, but it has happened. I've seen it, I've heard it, I've experienced it. But we've got to do a better job. I know we're running out of time, but I want to hear from you, Sister Rakia, on that particular issue.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. One of the biggest things throughout my work within juvenile justice has been helping parents realize that there are alternatives to calling the police on your children, right? And so even have police officers do trainings with parents around how not to call the police on your child, right? And so it's something that we have been so conditioned to view as acceptable, that we use the police and we use the courts to resolve most of the issues that come before us. So it's real easy for us to sue, you know, someone when something bad has happened, instead of mediating it. Just as it's easier for us to finally just say, you know what, and I won't say easier, because that's not fair. Because sometimes we just really don't know what to do. We're at our wits' end. And parents who call the police on their children often are doing that because they don't know anything else to do. They're trying to figure it out. And so we haven't done a good job as advocates. We haven't done a good job as electeds. We haven't done a good job as people who actually create an opportunity for resources to exist, to help people understand, help parents understand that there are other alternatives instead of calling the police on your child. And I think we have to do something better than that. I wanted to jump in on this conversation too, because one of the things that I forgot to mention that is happening here in Jackson right now is that the city council just passed an order that allows for people in Jackson to be picked up on misdemeanors because violence has increased in Jackson. So they said that it would be a good idea to pick people up on misdemeanors, arrest them and detain them, and to use COVID care funding to detain them in Yazoo County and Holmes County. Because in Hinds County, we have a consent decree that says you cannot detain a person on a misdemeanor. And that was because we were overutilizing detention as a form of incarceration for people that were committing misdemeanors, right? And so to get around that, they're going to use $500,000 to actually detain people from Jackson, take Jackson dollars and give it to Yazoo jail and Holmes County jail to detain folks on misdemeanors. This is problematic. This is problematic for many reasons. One, because it doesn't get to the root causes of people committing violence in the first place. The very things that you all have mentioned here, the lack of education around who we are, the beauty of our people, you know, the understanding of that, the lack of mentorship, the lack of investment in those very things that actually can prevent the violence from happening in the first place, and the lack of investment in new things like alternatives to detention, arrest diversion, and alternative to incarceration programs that actually don't institutionalize our children, but instead give them a way to actually be held accountable for their bad acts, and then also to move forward and develop into happy, healthy, contributing members of society. And so I wanted to mention that because that's an important thing, and we need people to actually know about it and stand with us in saying that, no, we're not okay. We're not okay with this decision that the council has made.
Thank you. Sheriff, if you had your magic wand, what would you ask your legislators to do, or what kind of legislation would you ask them to do to help you in your work down there up there in Grenada County?
More emphasis on mental health awareness. We run into a lot of situations where the mental health crimes that's being committed, we really don't have a place to keep them, to give them help. Locking up a person with mental illness isn't helping the situation. I have a call from a lot of families that want something done with their loved one that's becoming a problem, but jail is not the answer for it. But when they commit a crime, that's where we have to put them. But we're looking for alternatives to do something with the mental health. That is the biggest situation that I see.
I agree. I've been talking to the mayor and the police chief here in Columbus. I don't know if it's feasible, but we need someone on staff that handles just mentally ill individuals who officers come in contact with. That's all they do is deal with that. But I want to follow up, Sheriff Fair, you know, with what you just said. How do you preserve public safety in your sheriff department, letting the community know that your office is is also a resource. I mean, how do you let them know that?
Well, one thing I do is I try to improve the relationship with the community and the officers themselves. I also try to have a very diverse um, group of officers, very diverse. Everybody has their gift, and what I try to do is have them to mesh their gift with the citizens. You can de-escalate problems just by talking. Some people just want to hear what you got to say. They just want you to hear what they got to say. Therefore, instead of being very aggressive and everything, need to train the police officers to be more comfortable with different racial backgrounds. That is a must. If you're afraid of the people that you're trying to police, that's going to end up being a bad situation all the way around. The community relations, the county prosecutors, sheriffs, and the county government officials, they all set the tone for what happens next. If you have a great relationship with all of these individuals, things can get done. Slowly, things are getting done here in Grenada. I work closely with all the elected officials as well as the police department. And in turn, I have hired some police officers part-time as deputies, which is a win-win for the entire community.
Yes, sir. You know, as we wrap up, what are some tips that you will leave with the NAACP members as they attempt to improve relations between community and police in their areas? What would you recommend for them? Starting, Sheriff?
Community relations is an investment. We have to start there. If you're not involved in the community, you're not going to make a difference. That's the only thing that I can say that would probably work, that I can see that would work efficiently. You have to be honest and open with the residents about what's going on. For them to believe in you, you got to believe in them as well. You can't dehumanize them. You have to talk to them just like they are your brother, your sister. You got to give them the same respect, regardless of the situation. That would be my take on having a good way to move forward.
Thank you, Sheriff.
Thank you.
Ms. Lumumba?
Yeah, I think that in order to really improve community relations, I think that we also need to just recognize that the institution of policing is one that has always been an institution that has caused harm. And I think when we recognize that, then both police and people in the community can come to an agreement that what we're trying to do is transform that system. It's to really work from a place where we respect and appreciate the humanity of all of us. Can you all hear me now? So I'll try to repeat it. I think that the best way to improve community police relations is to start from a place where we recognize that the system of policing is one that was created actually as a form, an institution that has caused harm to poor people, to Black people, to Indigenous people. And I think once we began to really recognize that it's actually an institution of white supremacy, then we as both police officers, who actually are our community members, a lot of time here in Jackson and across Mississippi, that we can recognize that both police officers and community, we can begin to recognize that we have to transform the system. And once we really began to realize that transformation is our ultimate goal, then I think that we will learn how to respect and appreciate the humanity that both of us have in trying to create safety and a vision of safety that all of us agree on. A vision of safety that recognizes all of us as human beings. A vision of safety that cares about our children living good, happy, healthy lives. A vision of safety that sees Black children, Black men, Black women, Black people as human and not something to be feared. And so I look forward to that day. I believe it's possible. I know it's possible, because if Harriet Tubman could believe that slavery would end one day and then live to see it end, then I know that we can see a day when policing is transformed and that we've actually created a system of public safety that respects humanity and does not harm Black people.
Amen. And that we're not under no illusion. The system is working perfectly like it was intended to work. One thing that I would suggest, these civilian review boards, they have to be in every community as it relates to offering some sense of transparency in what's going on. I know the one in Columbus during my tenure on the council was very successful. And it's something that you have to work on and with all the time, and have some good people that are accountable, because the Civilian Review Board is the entity and conduit that keeps the community informed on what's happening in law enforcement. Even with this one that's established in Columbus, they have a part in the hiring, from my understanding now. You know, they sit in on the interview process when new officers are applying for the jobs, and I think that's great. That's just one caveat I wanted to throw out there. Is there anything else, Sheriff Fair, Ms. Lumumba, anything else that you would like to add on this particular question, on tips that we could give NAACP members to take back home to their hamlets and villages to help out in their areas?
So it was one thing I wanted to add is that some guiding legislation that I think that we all can look at and sign up to support is the breatheact.org. You can go to breatheact.org, and it is legislation that really is around transforming police departments across the nation, really about instituting community-led safety efforts, similar to what Sheriff Fair has indicated around having mental health practitioners and experts actually deal with mental health situations, and not relying on police to be a mental health provider, right? And so really encouraging folks to look at the breatheact.org. We can actually use the breatheact.org and create local breatheact.orgs, local breathe acts that can be implemented on a very hyper-local level in your cities and also in your state. And so I just wanted to add that. And I also wanted to just thank Sheriff Fair for just offering some very transformative ideas that I would love and hope that maybe he can share with some of us over here in Hinds County. So thank you.
Sheriff Fair?
Yes, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on this with you all. And I appreciate the compliments, and I were taking notes on all the things that you all was describing. So in the near future, I might be reaching out to work on an idea, a plan to try to get this county moving in the right direction, and maybe be able to help out some of the surrounding counties as well. I really do appreciate it.
And look, as a legislator, it doesn't stop here. To the NAACP members that are viewing this today, as well as the panelists, if you come up with any ideas that you think that we can use to move this particular issue forward as it pertains to legislation, please get in contact with me or your legislator or the chairwoman of the Mississippi Legislative Black Caucus, which is Angela Turner Ford. and see what we can do, because it's going to take all of us working together to alleviate and transform the criminal justice system. Well, I want to thank you all so much for an interesting dialogue on community policing. I can't thank you all enough. Rakia Lumumba, Dr. DeAndre Ore, and Sheriff Rolando Fair. I want to thank you all for joining us today on this panel. And I want to thank the State Conference of the NAACP for sponsoring this and for having me moderate this very, very important issue on criminal justice reform as well as community policing. Thank you all so much. Have a good day.